Hello everyone, today we talk about the province of Crete at Cyrenaica for our new series about the early imperial Roman provinces. As you know, this province pertains to the kind of Hellenistic part of the empire, consisting of the Hellenic island and the North African peninsula, respectively, of Crete and Cyrenaica. A composite territory, as you understand, because Cyrenaica was definitely, as most lands, especially in the eastern Mediterranean, substantially colonized coastally by the Greeks, and was part, as we will see now, of a broader Hellenistic, Diadochois power, such as the Ptolemaic kingdom. And in this sense, these lands were connected, right, coastally, right, whereas the Marmaris, the Cyrenaican interland was something else, was populated by Libyan tribes, Crete being a relatively tranquil place, right. The Romans would eat one by one, gradually, all the various Hellenistic powers, kingdoms, city-states, Crete following essentially in the latter's category, with at least multiple poleis that had not been ever, like in the recent centuries, the seat of any particular power. But still, it took, right, an expedition, it took a conquest, right. Initially the Romans had difficulties, and there are kind of funny anecdotes connected to the same cognomen, Creticus, associated, in fact, to the father of Mark Antony Aurelius. He was the one who tried and somewhat screwed up, so he was mocked by being called like an imperator, like the Creticus, the conqueror of Crete, even though he had obtained pretty mediocre results. In any case, these were not vital regions for, naturally, Roman power. It's the same reason why it took a while before conquering them. I mean, Cyrenaica, first place, being a sort of, again, subject pentapolis under the Ptolemaic rulers that, as you know, would be finally taken over by the Romans only with the Battle of Actium in 32 BC. So they were almost from the opposite side of the Mediterranean compared to Rome. The latter's land being definitely more important, and in this sense, Cyrenaica, Crete also is, as an area, we would have to as an island would bridge several regions of the Mediterranean, would help stabilizing these connections. But again, not having a dramatic political protagonism on their own. That's the same reason why we do not know even so much about. This is normal for many provinces, but at least the ones in which the Romans invested more military resources, we know of kind of, back and forth. We've seen it with Moesia and Thracia the other day. We know a bit more step by step who went there, how, why, how the provinces were organized militarily speaking, right, and how much proconsular power was attached to them, and so on, the number of legions. Here, it's something really much more composite. There isn't properly even a legion station. There are other forces, like cohorts, auxiliaries, etc. Namely, there is the Legio Tertia Cyrenaica that was, however, created seemingly at the time of the war of the Second Triumvirate by Mark Antony. It was known like that just because it was levied in Cyrenaica. These lands sided with Pompey, right, as the broader east during the previous war of the First Triumvirate, the civil war, right, between Caesar and Pompey, and that had become a triumvirate since Crassus had died by that point. And there were some military expeditions throughout the empire, especially when the Romans basically put down the Nazamones, that were a Berber tribe of the hinterland, the Roman commander referring back to the Senate, right, that he had impeded the Nazamones from existing, which tells you, not much just what the outcome of that campaign was, which was also difficult at some point, because the African hinterland there is it's desert, right? So Nazamones at some point managed to capture even the Roman baggages, but they seemingly got drunk with the Roman wine, and the Romans. It's a bit kind of a legendary anecdote, but still, they were able to say that the Berbers lowered the guard, and the Romans came and slaughtered them in the process. And in general, aside from, as we'll see now, the times of the Jewish revolt, because there were important communities in here too, was a tranquil province, right? Both Crete, especially Crete, and Cyrenaica, taking the actually the name was Cyrenai, right? The name of the province, Crete et Cyrenai, so actually referring to Crete and Cyrene as the city, right? Giving name to the peninsula. So more of this along the way. So the territory of Cyrenaica occupied, the Roman one I'm talking about, occupied the coast of North Africa, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, up to the so-called Arae Philenorum, right? That is to say, on the Gulf of Sirte to the west. The legend of the Philenoi, that were some Carthaginian heroes, was about the historical conflictuality and rivalry existing between the Hellenic colonists, in fact, of Cyrenaica, and the Phoenician ones of Africa, let's say of Tunisia, geographically speaking of the modern country, who had challenged each other to a racing competition to establish the boundary between the two peoples, which up to that point had been actually arguing a lot on it. So the idea is that this kind of athletes would run as much as they could, and the meeting point would be established officially, internationally, as the boundary between the two areas. And this would become the Arae Philenorum, but they basically started accusing each other of having actually cheated, because some had left before than the others, and so on. But that exemplifies a bit the inherent tension existing between the Libo-Phoenicians and the Libo-Hellenes, fundamentally. That's an area. It's a bit neglected area, let's say, as far as the spheres of influence of the Carthaginians and the Hellenic colonies of the coast. Let's remember this, because the hinterland was all Libyan again, and it functioned in very different ways. Right? There were primitives, as you know. The Libyans, like the Northern Europeans, were the only ones basically still using chariot warfare up to relatively late. It was actually the Romans who introduced camels in North Africa, so to confer eventually that more exotic, further exotic character to local warfare. Also made a bit about the Battle of Mammes, a fight that was, with the Maori on the other side of North Africa. We'll talk about that, because actually I think the next chapter will be about Roman Mauritania, which is also fascinating, a bit more at the outskirts of the war. But these were, right, that the Roman boundary, the desert, was the most lightly garrisoned in the first place, because they needed just a few, let's say, even palisades, ditches, and so on. And whenever these Berber bands entered the Roman controlled area, they had to waste a substantial amount of time to, again, first of all, destroy the palisades, the fortifications. Then eventually would have in order to save time, to come back exactly to the place that had been broken. Very often the Romans are waiting there, or similar things. No, actually, everything was much more in depth by some standards already in defense. But let's say that just as I always say, in terms of civilization, the most primitive peoples are also objectively the least threatening one, especially as unitary powers. To, in this case, powers like, I don't know, the Macedonians, the Carthaginians, the Romans, right, in North Africa. In any case, what this is in the western border, right, to the east, the desert and an intrusive coast separated Cyrenaica from Aegyptus, from Roman Egypt. The limit was constituted in this case by the Gulf of Solon. Between the end of the 1st and the 2nd century AD, the eastern border between the two Roman provinces was moved to Derna, anyway, so reducing actually the territory of Crete and Cyrenaica. These southern boundaries, we were saying, was just marked by desert, right, where the deserted areas began, so where the local agriculture could not sustain a civilization. Well, it was it, right? It had always been the case. That's why it's also just mostly a coastal area, especially throughout. Like Cyrenaica per se has an interesting weather because it has a bit of mountains in the properly in the hinterland that gather, stabilize some kind of humid currents from the Mediterranean and so on. But if you pick any other, the broader Libyan desert in other areas between Cyrenaica and Egypt, for example, it's just desert, more or less. Yes, you may have some kind of fertility on the coastline, but virtually, like, this is not like, I don't know, Tunisia, that is actually a fertile place. It's and even other parts of northwestern Africa to a degree, it's not immediately desert in the hinterland, but here it is, right? Then you have Egypt, which has the fertile Nile Valley, which is an entirely different story. We'll see that because it was one, as you know, of the most important strategic assets of the Roman Empire, exactly for grain exports to Rome, etc. However, going back to Crete and Cyrenaica, a large discussion has concerned the date in which these two lands, where two separated lands would make up the province, were actually annexed by Rome, right? And the moment in which they were united into a single province as well. We don't know that so much because simply they weren't so very important regions to make much history about themselves, and nor the Romans when they seized them. In any case, from the mid-3rd century BC, Cyrenaica had been under the dominion of Ptolemaic Egypt, right? Ptolemaic kingdom. I made a video here and there about, especially the army organization last year, extended its control to the cities of, in fact, Cyrenae, Ptolemais, Arsinoi, and Cyrenaica, the latter being Benghazi, right, in Libya today. In fact, the stele bearing the will with which in 155 BC the pharaoh Ptolemy VIII Evergetes II Tryphon promised to leave his kingdom to the Romans. He actually wouldn't specify which kingdom, right? It's a generic term, and as you know, the thing wouldn't happen, right, overnight. Nor we think that it had to do, in fact, specifically with chunks of the whole kingdom, and specifically with this one. As you know, Egypt underwent a crisis exactly from this time onwards, was massively indebted. Eventually the Romans just walked in because they had bought the country and maintaining just a bit like the fiction of Egyptian independence, right? But It was not even a threat, right? The Romans had to fight, as you know, against the Antigonians, against the Seleucids. Those were really, back in the day, the main problem. Egypt was kind of cool with Rome, right? They didn't want trouble. They would have been easily invaded, right? So the thing went on, as we were saying before, for more than a century. In 96 BC, Ptolemy Appian, who was the legitimate son of Vercingetorix II and king of Cyrenaica, died and bequeathed his kingdom to Rome. Right, so again, we don't know exactly how this whole thing happened, like what was going on. Surely the Romans were sending, as it was normal, just certain, like the area was frequented by Roman citizens. The Romans were surely sending some type of troops and assistance, and again, these had become client states already by some degree. And the reason why these rulers would eventually just gift Rome with their own realms left in inheritance was, again, in most cases a Roman extortion that just betrayed most obvious evidence that these countries were not capable of ruling themselves independently anymore, and that Roman power was just there, right? It was just manifesting together with the Imperium for taking over. That's, however, when we think, in fact, the Romans seized control properly of Cyrenaica as such, which, however, wouldn't become immediately a province. In the process of the Roman takeover, the Hellenic poleis were declared liberi in Latin, while the agri regi were forfeited in the Roman ager publicus. So what happened here is somewhat typical of an Hellenistic kingdom, right? The Hellenic poleis, just in the wake of Alexander's legacy that the Romans are very eager to collect, are liberi. So they're free by definition, which means not that they weren't in simply equal terms with Rome just per se, because the evidence was another one. None of these centers had any chance, right, at this point to withstand the Republic. If anything, is just again, not forcing hands. There's not a major like campaign invasion, whatever. They simply realize, okay, we are within it in the first place. Let's simply accept the fact that at least the cities are free in a general sense, because we all live in a world of free men in theory. These are not slaves. We haven't conquered them. They haven't betrayed any fate, broadly meant. So we just treat them with the condition of favor, because again, they're not just as polis a territorial threat, right? Mostly the Hellenistic kingdoms were political territorial realities capable of mobilizing a substantial amount of manpower, etc. These ones were at best, they're local city militias, and some peasant they could coerce from the immediate countryside. Again, because the hinterland is also not particularly it's actually a fertile area. Don't get me wrong, but there is not like the socio-economical backbone to provide with, soldiery, right? The Romans would more likely hire some, Berbers from the hinterland, and using this city's forces just, say, in contained numbers, right? Not to pressure them too much. But obviously, there was nothing these polis could really do. They were free, like most, say, Hellenic entities would remain under Rome, but under Rome, right? It's a condition of, I tell you essentially what to do, and yes, we are free, but it's just like to give you the satisfaction of a formal, denial of your subjugation, right? This is the point. plus the lands that had belonged to these cities still under as we've seen, essentially a royal rule, right, of branches properly of the Ptolemaic, so the pharaohs, the divine, at least for this Hellenistic kind of mindset, like especially for the ethnic locals that are more habituated to the concept of pharaohs, of divine race ruling over an immense amount of people that are basically just his servants conceptually. And in fact, are organized, mostly inhabiting as colonists, but are here in Latin, the agri regi, that is to say, the royal estates, right? The royal fields, literally. The latter being simply integrated by Rome in the ager publicus. So in other words, the ager Romanus. And so basically, this is the most concrete evidence of what, freedom really the cities had, because it was not the cities, estates that, let's say, the Romans were simply seizing, right? At least the polis liberi were now even sort of freed by the Romans from this other kind of Hellenistic domination. But de facto, those Hellenistic rulers had been ruling on the base of the latifundia, that now the Romans were simply seizing and taking for the road and becoming properly Roman property without any intermediary. So everything working smoothly, as you understand, on the tip of the sword, because there's really no other chance these locals have against Roman force. In 87 BC, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, that was a quaestor of Sulla, during his mission in the Mediterranean to obtain reinforcements in the war against Mithridates, king of Pontus. You know that Lucullus was one of the most talented Roman commanders of his time. He just wouldn't have a dramatic manpower supporting him, but he really scored his substantial amount of victories in the east. Reached Crete, Cyrene, and Egypt. Right, he visited this place. In Cyrene, that at this point was crossed by civil war because the locals, also a bit together with the Romans, the Romans are also having their own internal strife, etc., were either supporting one side or the other, clashing. There were just even local interests at stake, important, temples to be controlled, and in part even the same lands that the Romans would subcontract by a degree. And in fact, the connections, the necessary connection with the Roman lords, right, and their clienteles in the process. Lucullus restores order and proceeds to carry out constitutional reforms locally to kind of fix a bit the area. There is discontent. He wants to leave this land orderly and tidy so that he can maintain some personal connections with that as well. On behalf of Sulla, by the way, the main problem of the region laid in its peripheral location in many ways, because as we've seen, it was devoid of substantial military garrisons as such. The same Romans were intermittently present because they mostly needed their forces here and there. There was war among them in the same Italy. It's a very complicated situation. We will see it in the history of Rome series more broadly, right? So the Romans would mostly rely on the local polis that best could put together, as we've seen, some unprofessional force from their leagues. There was also another, there were different threats coming from the external. Not much, again, the Berbers of the hinterland that didn't have much of a shot against, these Hellenistic fortifications, but rather the Mediterranean pirates that had been intensifying their attacks after the death of Ptolemy Apio in 94 BC, which, let's say, had brought at least some kind of support through the Egyptian connections and so on. As we'll see now, it's Pompey, famously enough, that puts an end to at least the wide majority of piracy in the Mediterranean at that point. Again, these were just war bands, right, of some rabble from the coast, as you know, of Cilicia, for example, a bit all around the Mediterranean. There were Romans within, for sure. Piracy has always been that kind of multinational in nature, but they were a serious problem because they reduced the potential of these regions that relied, broadly speaking, in a Hellenistic world on this kind of, again, coastal connection. And the Romans had invested themselves in such a land, so it was important just to tidy it up. In 75-74 BC, Cyrenaica, after, in fact, years of instability, would have finally been reduced to a province. The Roman quaestor was sent there to administrate it, and he was provided with a praetorian imperium. Right. This quaestor was Publius Cornelius Lentulus Marcellinus, to be specific, who remained there in 74 or until the beginning of 73 BC. It's not certain that he was really the governor of the province, though. It is noted that no Roman official is recorded in Cyrenaica until 67 BC, when Cneius Cornelius Lentulus Marcellinus, that was the legatus pro praetore of Pompey in the War of the Pirates, arrives. And this overlaps with what we were saying before, that is, up to that point, until piracy was quelled, the province had remained fundamentally a bit out there on her own. Right, and again, the Romans cared relatively. Marcellinus, in fact, having carried out an intense administrative activity in Cyrenaica, is also well documented by the inscriptions locally. So we know that essentially, in practice, the organization of Cyrenaica goes back to Pompey. Again, we don't have the certainty of how or when it was formally established, but it's basically on Pompey's the achievement of stabilizing it, of starting like a functional government that could take care efficiently, right, of the situation there. Many doubts remain, by the way, regarding the Roman officials sent to the regions in the following years. Cicero records in 63 BC the presence of the proquaestore Marcus Juventius Laterensis. It is uncertain whether this guy operated alone or under the command of a governor of praetorian rank, right? From October 51 BC, Cyrenaica was probably included, however, among the praetorian provinces of Rome. During the 1st century BC, the presence of Italian negotiatores and publicani, right, so merchants, and essentially those who were subcontracted, the administration of the province, respectively, so in charge of the exploitation, especially as we've seen of the agri regi, right, of the former Hellenistic latifundia, appears to be documented, right? In fact, these guys are in December 64 BC subject of the agricultural rogatio of Publius Servilius Rullus, which provided for their sale So we know that the Roman administrators had by now gained sound footing locally through the senatorial clienteles and all. It is also worth remembering that Apollonia, that was the fifth city of the Cyrenaican Pentapolis, dates back to the period between the 2nd century and 67 BC, right? So this city that was, would be an historical one again of the Cyrenaican coast, may have been linked properly to the Roman establishment in the territory as such and developed further, because naturally the Romans had, wherever they installed themselves in the provinces, generally speaking, their favorite place, favorite market, the one that they wanted to privilege for whichever political, strategic reason, not just the mere exploitation of it, of course, the exploitation of the province, but let's say depending on also what the other communities did or said, right? Because naturally, as we were saying before, the Romans were arriving, say, unforced, and the locals had more or less to obey to whichever direction they were given. This is as far as Cyrenaica is concerned. Regarding the annexation of Crete, we have more definite data. At least it's Marcus Antonius Creticus, right? Creticus in bracket exactly, because it was a mockery title rather than a true cognomen that we mentioned before. In 74 BC, obtained a special command of about 3 years against the pirates, right? And Crete was actually hosting some of their nests, right? And you understand also why Cyrenaica had been harassed. So the Romans are taking care through different directions, putting down piracy, and Crete was just considered like, again, not truly much of a problem, right? So these guys were given the actual money from the agrarium. They were charged at this point to hire their own given amount of troops, of ships, whatever. They mostly had, however, to take care, as you know, politically, strategically, this whole enterprise, right? And Marcus Antonius invaded Crete without much success, thus, attracting all the mockery of the Roman establishment, because it was just like, if you can't conquer Crete, but what about the rest? Admittedly, it was not like just a child's play. Again, everything could go wrong in many ways, right? But just the Romans were habituated at that point to carry out much more impressive feats. However, the annexation of Crete was decided by the Senate in 70 BC. So Crete was another province at this point. In fact, the island obtained this sphere of jurisdiction that the province basically consisted of, and was reserved for one of the consuls the following year, 69 BC. As you understand, there were advantages we were saying before. You could reach Cyrenaica from there. It was close to the Hellenic mainland. You could reach roads in the east, right? That you could land in Asia Minor, going east towards Cilicia and Syria and so on. So it was, generally speaking, conquering it, an important Roman objective, like as an auxiliary measure, right? An ancillary measure for supporting their supply line, for their army, the fleet, and so on. After the refusal of Hortensius Ortalus, who had been selected for the job by lot, right? It's Quinctus Caecilius Metellus Creticus to be sent to Crete. in 66-65 BC, and would in fact proceed to annex and organize the island as a province proper, right? Because the Romans had decided beforehand this was a province. Now let's just, except we have still to send someone there to actually take the reins of the local government. That this was done, right? As you know, Crete developed longitudinally. There were some, there was some resistance. Admittedly, as you know, Crete was the sea of one of the most famed mercenaries of the ancient world in the guise of archers, etc. But aside from some city that had to be, had to render homage to Rome by some degree, was nothing complicated about it. We do not have data relating to the Cretan administration of Quintus Caecilius Metellus, but the island, a Praetorian province, remained distinct from Cyrenaica for a few more years, right? In 444 BC, just after Caesar had been assassinated, the Roman Senate assigned the island to the government of Marcus Junius Brutus. Right, this is the moment in which basically there is a sort of amnesty negotiated, as you know, between Octavian and Antony, and generally speaking, other senatorial media were at that point supporting still the former for Cassius and Brutus. So much so that Cyrenae was entrusted to Gaius Cassius Longinus. Right, so they paired Crete and Cyrenaica for Brutus and Cassius, respectively, together with other land, as you know, in the east, that they had taken control of anyway, having fled there. Now, Marcus Antonius, as part of his reorganization of the East after, essentially, we are, as you know, in the second triumvirate, and the destruction, the death of the Caesaricides, Antony gets the East, right? So he controlled these lands, and he brought Cyrenaica and even part of Crete at this point back under Ptolemaic rule. This was done just to please the Easterners, mostly Egypt, right? It's not much that he was doing as the brilliant, excellent, splendid Octavian propaganda wanted, just everything that Cleopatra said. But it was important because, in a sense, as you know, Egypt was already that political and territorial reality from which Antony ruled from, right? So reannexating these territories in force of his legions, maintained in the Nile Valley, etc., was useful administratively, and to the general reinforcement of that power base that had, let's remember this, an unspeakable amount of wealth, right? The West had the main manpower, especially in Cisalpine Gaul. That's why Octavian really had the upper hand, but the East had like a traumatic amount of actual money, right? That had been Pompey's choice, right? And it didn't work, right? At this point, as you know, Antony was searching a bit like the fortune in the Parthian campaign that was Caesar's purpose, at least before death, and a bit of an Alexandrian thing, also just because he was he remained very Roman throughout the whole thing. Again, it's all a myth that he was like behaving just as an Hellenistic monarch or whatever, but naturally ruling there he had to grant something to the locals. It's like the same of Octavian and later Augustus that, of course, would not, as I always say, tolerate any Roman. Like the concept was completely alien, right? To kneel in front of him, like the proskynesis. That will be introduced in the later centuries because the Romans are a body of God's chosen people, and nobody can make them kneel. Like they can't be serfs of slaves by definition. Whereas Augustus was perfectly fine being depicted like a pharaoh in Egypt, right, and continuing there the Egyptian and Hellenistic, partly Persian legacy of how they saw the rulers there. And by the way, we probably owe Octavian the deduction of a colony of Roman veterans in Knossos, the Colonia Julia Nobilis Knossos, interestingly enough, so that Knossos, Julian noble colony, right? So a bit of their injection of Roman citizenry. Octavian also awarded Capua in Italy as compensation for what had happened during the civil wars, some land near the same Knossos, and declared Cudonia. These are all, as you understand, famous Cretan centers, Lapa, and possibly even Polyrrhenia, as free cities in a similar fashion to the Polis Liberae, let's say, in the Alexandrine model. We do not have reliable information on when the two territories were actually and formally united in a single province. In 27 BC, however, we know that the province, in fact the provincia of Crete et Cyrenae, was attributed to the Roman Senate and was administered by a proconsul of Praetorian rank who lived, by the way, on the island in Gortuna. The city also became, as a consequence, the seat of the island's koinon, that is essentially the league of the Cretan cities. So that would be a further unity of intent between the Roman governors and the local communities. Cyrene, on the other hand, was equally the seat of the Roman governor in Cyrenaica. The governors of the province are known at a certain point, some of whom even underwent trials for mismanagement, things like that. For example, Caesius Cardus in 21 BC, Castius Proculus in 56 AD, Paedius Blessus, who was also kicked out of the Senate in 59, Antonius Flamma in 70. So these are all figures you can check out if you're interested, I guess. And as regards to the administration, quaestors supported the activity of the governor. And one of them would be the future Emperor Vespasian, by the way. So that an illustrious name connected to the local administration of this province. The epigraphic documentation returns numerous testimonies relating specifically to the procuratores provinciae Cretae, right? So the procurators of the Cretan province, and procurators are witnessed in Cyrenaica as well. So that's how kind of relatively scanty our documentation is. But again, they're modest provinces, and it's normal for these types not to have all that information. Now, the two territories, so the island and the region of the African coast facing the Mediterranean, although united, as you understand, didn't have an enormous much to do with one another, right? Admittedly, yes, one was an Hellenic island proper, and it was just geographically close to the Hellenically colonized Cyrenaican coast, right? But at the same time, they had very different profiles, right? As we've seen, Crete was, first of all, just the fact that it is an island, it says everything, right? As a mentality, generally speaking, was also a substantially fertile area. As you know, even later on in Byzantine history, will become the garden of the Constantinopolitan emperor. Cyrenaica instead was, as we've seen, first of all connected with Egypt just by, I guess, the westernmost territory, right, acting as a sort of client state rather than part of Egypt proper. The hinterland was populated by Berber tribes, so it's a bit of a different story. In Augustan times, Cyrenaica had still a modest military contingent. Again, the Romans didn't see the point of loading this territory with forces, right? And at some point, at least, the Libyan tribes of Marmaris began to invade the area, to raid the estates, things like that. But there wasn't much of a concern. I mean, the reason why you could think these raids happened, they happened in many other provinces, right? They again, the Romans were not upset because Cyrenaica now was suffering some of this. There was a local, again, military presence. It was enough. There was basically no great interest to just going to interland and crushing this tribe. So in a sense, the Romans were, as you know, much more aggressively projected, like in the lands of Central Europe, right? Just for projecting massive military force there. Here, the worst that could happen was literally this. What happened though that engulfed the entire region was in between 115 and 17 A.D. when Cyrenaica was crossed by the Jewish revolt, which had spread violently, as you know, in the Levant, in Egypt, in Cyprus, even in Mesopotamia. So there was a lot behind that, because you know the Jews were sponsored by the Parthians, that, albeit never giving up the idea of contending the Levant with the Romans, were a bit timid, right, in the interference during the revolt, right? The Jews were just rebelling for their own reasons. You know, we will see. We've never made videos about the Jewish wars, but quite fascinating. And you know that the Romans went hard on them, right? They're basically the only people who risked literal genocide, which doesn't mean killing lots of people. It means a very specific political thing. And if it hadn't been for Jews that were together with the Romans, that would have actually happened. In any case, also that crisis was resolved, so it was nothing inherent, Cyrenaica per se, aside from the Jewish presence, but mostly the destabilization of this entire region, and the sense that, of course, Rome was still occupying somebody else's land, so the Romans were at this point still consistent Western occupants in an Eastern mindset. Now, during the 1st century A.D., so we're talking between Claudius and Domitian, there was an intense activity from the Roman side, both in Crete and Cyrenaica, aimed at recovering the lands belonging to the Roman people or to the cities. Because, again, we think of Rome as surely hegemonic, as she was, but we have, from the 19th century onwards, a very distorted idea, usually, what this domination actually meant. Right? It was not just like a direct control. Mostly, the Roman heartland was just Italy and a few other close centers, most from which the majority of troops were levied, but say living out there in say within the colonies in Crete or in Cyrenaica, well, it still meant being far from, let's say, even from order, from authority. At least things worked with the military present, local governors, etc. But there was still some degree of disorder could happen, as we've seen with these revolts, etc. So it was not just a merely peaceful situation. In any case, it was also the Hellenic cities now that were asking the Roman emperors for more rights. In a sense, for example, during the Principality of Hadrian, that was very Hellenistic mindset by a degree, Cyrenaica asked the emperor for the admission to the Panhellenion. There was a large league of Hellenic city-states, in fact, established by the same emperor, and the Cyrenaians here thought that they somehow counted as this broader Hellenic world, specifically not Hellenistic in a broader sense, but literally like a Greek world, right? And encompassing, let's say the classical Greece, right? You're talking about Megara, Sparta, Chalkis, Argos, Achaia. There are lots of, even Thessalonica, for example, and even some cities of Crete, right? So the Cyrenaians thought, we want to be part of that as well. The city of Cyrenaica asked Antoninus Pius, unsuccessfully by the way, to become the seat of a conventus, that is the seat of a subdivision of some provinces, right? The sort of capital, lesser capital within the same province, and so say we are something on their own, right? And this was important because it would have conferred a much greater power, and it meant just to impart discontent the other communities of the province. So at least here the Romans do not really care about, because again the Panhellenion was something more, there were some practical benefits, but it was also a matter of general prestige, and it's still a broader union of peers, as they intended that this was really something much more autonomistically administrative in nature, and the Romans said no. Among the most important epigraphic documents from Cyrenaica, we shall remember the edicts issued by Augustus, the first four in 7 and 6 BC, the fifth at the beginning of 4 BC, that concerned the judicial organization of Cyrenaica. Right? So these are interesting documents. There is also the so-called Senatus Consultum Calvisianum, which is associated with the fifth edict that regulates the provisions of the processes of the De Repetundis that were, as you know, were quite meaningful for the local provinces, because they had to do with the recovery of property in practice, and the with aspects that were trying to fix the local corruption, but government and so on, abuses, so gaining more, making things work right in a more orderly fashion, lawfully fashion, locally, right? Our series stops, to probably the early empire. I think Diocletian is a fair end term. So I could make also the history of the late Roman provinces at some point, and here and there, especially in the Byzantine history playlist, we tend to browse those here and there, even though that was a bit of a different world. Here we look at essentially the establishment of Roman control on specific provinces from the moment essentially of greater power that Rome had in relative as well as absolute, let's be honest, terms, not just on the single provinces, but entire empire in the first place. So it's interesting to look at them in in this case it's a bit of an exception, of not a deeply unusual one, as coupling some. We've seen it with, at least in the other videos I talked about Moesia and Thracia together, but they weren't, right? But there are other provinces that essentially were the sum of two different lands. This one is fascinating because they are somehow overlooked as being a bit more peripheral, right, in nature, but they're interesting. They still looking at the ambition, after all, of some centers that felt to have been part of a considerable past, at least in Hellenistic times, and or they wanted to get their place in the new establishment to a degree, at least locally, and that's it. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.